You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Copyright and licensing represent two of the most important and at times contentious areas of legal and ethical concern in the development and deployment of artificial intelligence systems. Copyright is the body of law that protects creative works such as books, articles, music, images, or software code, while licensing defines the contractual terms under which those works may be used. In the AI context, copyright and licensing touch on both inputs and outputs, the training data that teaches models to perform tasks, and the generated material that models produce for end users. Questions arise about whether training on copyrighted data is permissible, whether outputs infringe on underlying works, and who owns the rights to AI-generated creations. These issues are not merely theoretical. They have already prompted lawsuits, regulatory inquiries, and heated debates about fairness, ownership, and innovation. Understanding copyright and licensing is therefore essential for responsible AI adoption, as it defines the boundaries of lawful and ethical practice. In the context of AI, copyright protects creative works that may be included in training datasets or mirrored in generated outputs. For example, if a model is trained on novels, images, or source code, those materials may be covered by copyright law, restricting how they can be used. Copyright exists automatically when a work is created, without requiring formal registration, meaning that vast amounts of online content are copyrighted even if no explicit notice appears. For AI practitioners, this reality creates uncertainty. What counts as permissible training, and what risks exist when models produce outputs that resemble protected works? These uncertainties make copyright a defining challenge in AI development, as the scale of data collection often makes it difficult to distinguish what is safely usable from what requires explicit permission. Training data challenges arise because modern AI models depend on enormous datasets collected from the internet, repositories, or commercial sources. Many of these datasets include copyrighted material, sometimes intentionally and sometimes inadvertently. Developers face the practical difficulty of filtering copyrighted content without losing valuable diversity or volume. Moreover, the boundaries of legality are not always clear. Some argue that training models on copyrighted works constitutes fair use or an equivalent exception under various legal systems, while others argue that it is unauthorized exploitation. Beyond legality, the ethical question persists. Do creators deserve credit or compensation when their work indirectly contributes to an AI system's capabilities? These challenges underscore the complexity of aligning copyright with the realities of large-scale machine learning. Doctrines like fair use in the United States or fair dealing in other jurisdictions play an important role in determining whether copyrighted works may be used in AI training. Fair use allows limited use of copyrighted material without permission, provided certain conditions are met, such as whether the use is transformative, the amount of material used, and the effect on the market for the original. Advocates argue that training AI is transformative, since models learn statistical patterns rather than copying works directly. Critics counter that outputs can sometimes reproduce content too closely, blurring the line. Courts have yet to fully settle these questions, meaning that fair use remains a hopeful but uncertain shield for AI developers. Its scope will likely be defined by ongoing litigation, with outcomes shaping how training data is handled in future systems. Licensing requirements create further complexity. Many datasets, APIs, or libraries are distributed under licenses that explicitly define how they may be used. A dataset licensed for academic research, for example, may not legally be used for commercial product development. Similarly, APIs that provide access to data often include terms prohibiting scraping, redistribution, or use for training. Violating these licenses can expose organizations to both legal and reputational risks. Licensing compliance therefore becomes a cornerstone of responsible AI development, requiring organizations to audit their data sources carefully and ensure that they align with intended uses. Clear licensing reduces ambiguity, but it also creates obligations that organizations must respect, balancing ambition with responsibility. Open-source licensing adds another layer of governance, since many AI models and datasets are shared under permissive or restrictive licenses. Licenses like MIT or Apache allow broad use, including commercial applications, provided that attribution and disclaimers are maintained. Others, like the GNU General Public License (GPL) or Creative Commons non-commercial licenses, impose stricter requirements, such as prohibiting proprietary use or mandating that derivative works also remain open source. These conditions affect how models and datasets can be integrated into enterprise workflows. Failure to comply can invalidate rights or create liabilities. For organizations, open-source licensing is both an opportunity expanding access to resources and a risk, requiring disciplined governance to ensure compliance. Attribution duties arise under many licensing frameworks, requiring organizations to credit the original creators of datasets, models, or tools. Attribution demonstrates respect for creators, but it also provides legal protection by satisfying license terms. For example, using a Creative Commons attribution dataset obligates the user to acknowledge the source in any resulting work. In AI, attribution becomes more complex because of the scale of data and the difficulty of tracing contributions. Nonetheless, efforts are emerging to track and credit sources systematically, recognizing that attribution is not only a legal duty, but also a matter of transparency and fairness. By giving credit, organizations reinforce trust with creators and users alike, signaling that they respect intellectual contributions. The copyright status of AI-generated outputs remains unsettled in many jurisdictions. Some authorities argue that copyright requires human authorship, meaning AI-generated works are not eligible for protection. Others allow for human-AI collaboration, granting rights to the person who directed or shaped the generation. The absence of consensus creates uncertainty for organizations relying on AI outputs, particularly in creative industries. If outputs cannot be copyrighted, companies may struggle to enforce ownership or prevent competitors from replicating their work. On the other hand, if outputs are protected, questions arise about whether they infringe on underlying training data. This ambiguity highlights the tension between innovation and legal frameworks that were not designed with AI in mind. Ownership ambiguities extend beyond copyright eligibility to questions of who controls AI-generated works. If a company licenses access to a hosted model, do they own the outputs exclusively, or does the provider retain rights? If a developer uses an open-source model, are outputs governed by the same license as the model itself? These uncertainties have prompted organizations to scrutinize terms of service and contracts carefully, ensuring that they align with intended use. Ownership questions also touch on broader debates about creativity, agency, and responsibility. Who deserves credit when a system generates work based on countless human contributions in training data? Until laws evolve, ownership will remain a negotiated and contested issue. Enterprise risk is significant in this domain, as companies face legal, financial, and reputational exposure if they mishandle copyright or licensing. Lawsuits over training data sources, misuse of licensed datasets, or improper attribution can result in damages, fines, or injunctions. Beyond legal costs, reputational harm can erode customer trust and investor confidence. Enterprises must therefore treat copyright and licensing as core governance challenges, building compliance into procurement, data pipelines, and deployment. Risk management in this area is not just about avoiding penalties but also about demonstrating corporate responsibility, ensuring that innovation does not come at the expense of ethical and legal obligations. Regulatory scrutiny of AI systems is growing, with lawsuits, investigations, and legislative initiatives focusing on the use of copyrighted data. Creators and publishers have challenged whether their works were used in training without consent, while policymakers debate whether new frameworks are needed to protect intellectual property in the age of AI. These developments highlight the growing tension between innovation and creator rights. Regulatory outcomes will shape the landscape of AI adoption, potentially requiring new licensing mechanisms, royalties, or data sharing frameworks. For enterprises, staying ahead of regulatory trends is essential to avoid being caught off guard by shifting expectations. Attribution in outputs offers a practical way to reduce risks of misappropriation. By grounding AI outputs in cited sources or providing references, organizations can demonstrate that results are based on transparent evidence rather than opaque training. For example, retrieval-augmented systems that cite source documents reduce legal and ethical risks, since they make clear where information originated. Attribution also improves trust with users, who can verify claims rather than accepting them at face value. While not always legally required, attribution provides a protective layer, aligning with both ethical principles and emerging best practices in responsible AI. Ethical considerations extend beyond legal compliance, reminding organizations that respecting creator rights is also a moral obligation. Even if courts ultimately permit broad use of copyrighted data for training, failing to acknowledge or compensate creators may erode public trust and harm creative communities. Ethical governance means balancing innovation with fairness, ensuring that AI systems do not exploit human contributions without recognition. By embedding respect for creators into policies and practices, organizations demonstrate that they value human work even as they leverage machine learning. This ethical stance builds goodwill and reinforces the legitimacy of AI adoption. Bias can inadvertently emerge from copyright filters, creating fairness challenges. If datasets are aggressively scrubbed of copyrighted works, they may lose representation of certain communities, genres, or cultural outputs. This skews training distributions, potentially leading to models that perform poorly on underrepresented content. Balancing copyright compliance with diversity is therefore critical, requiring thoughtful strategies to preserve inclusivity while respecting intellectual property. This challenge illustrates the interconnectedness of legal and ethical governance. Decisions about copyright compliance can ripple into fairness and bias, shaping the capabilities and limitations of AI systems. International variations in copyright law complicate governance further, since legal definitions and protections differ across jurisdictions. For example, the European Union recognizes stronger rights for authors than the United States, and some countries impose moral rights that require perpetual acknowledgement of creators. These differences affect how datasets can be used, how outputs are protected, and what obligations organizations face when operating globally. Enterprises must navigate this patchwork carefully, often adopting the strictest applicable standard to ensure global compliance. International differences underscore the need for flexible governance frameworks that adapt to diverse legal and cultural contexts. As organizations grapple with copyright and licensing challenges, they increasingly recognize that vendor strategy is central to risk management. Partnering with providers who document training sources, clarify ownership of outputs, and assume liability for licensing disputes reduces exposure. Enterprises must evaluate vendor terms carefully, ensuring that contracts align with legal, ethical, and business priorities. Copyright and licensing are not isolated issues but integral parts of vendor relationships, shaping how organizations build, deploy, and sustain AI systems in practice. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Dataset transparency has emerged as one of the most important practices for reducing copyright and licensing risks in AI systems. Transparency means documenting where data came from, how it was collected, and under what terms it is being used. For organizations, this documentation provides legal defensibility, showing regulators or courts that reasonable efforts were made to comply with licensing obligations. Transparency also helps developers understand the limitations of their datasets, such as whether they can be used commercially or only in academic contexts. Beyond compliance, dataset transparency builds trust with users and stakeholders, who increasingly want to know whether their data or the works of others has been included in training. It represents a cultural shift toward accountability, moving away from opaque data scraping practices toward a model where openness and responsibility form the foundation of governance. Model cards extend the principle of transparency by providing disclosures about licensing terms, dataset sources, and intended use cases directly alongside models. A well-designed model card does not only describe technical metrics like accuracy, but also outlines the ethical and legal context, what licenses apply to training data, whether copyrighted works were included, and what restrictions govern outputs. These disclosures build trust with users, ensuring they understand both the capabilities and limitations of the system. For enterprises, model cards also demonstrate due diligence, showing that licensing has been considered at every stage of deployment. Model card practices are still maturing, but they are becoming a widely recommended standard, reinforcing the idea that responsible AI requires not only performance metrics but also governance transparency. Watermarking and provenance technologies provide additional tools for attribution and authenticity. Watermarking embeds imperceptible signals in AI-generated outputs, allowing them to be identified later as machine-generated. Provenance tracking, meanwhile, links outputs back to specific data sources or model versions. Together, these techniques help ensure that creators receive credit and that organizations can defend against allegations of plagiarism or misappropriation. For example, a media company using generative AI may watermark all outputs to distinguish them from human-created works, preserving trust with audiences. Provenance also supports legal compliance, as it provides a traceable record of what data contributed to training or outputs. While technical challenges remain, watermarking and provenance represent critical components of future governance, helping align copyright obligations with technological realities. Output use restrictions are often embedded in model licenses, creating rules about how generated material can be applied. Some open models explicitly prohibit commercial use, while others forbid deployment in high-risk contexts such as healthcare or law. These restrictions reflect both legal concerns and ethical boundaries set by creators or providers. Organizations must review these terms carefully, as violating them can expose enterprises to liability or reputational damage. For example, using a model trained on non-commercial data to develop a paid product may breach licensing conditions. Respecting output restrictions is not just about legal compliance but also about building partnerships in the AI ecosystem, where honoring the conditions of others' work supports long-term collaboration and trust. Contracts with providers represent a crucial mechanism for managing copyright and licensing risks in enterprise contexts. These agreements define who is liable if data sources are challenged, who owns the outputs, and how disputes will be handled. Enterprises often seek indemnification clauses, where providers assume responsibility for licensing issues, protecting buyers from legal exposure. Providers may also commit to documenting training sources or ensuring that datasets comply with specific regulations. Contractual clarity reduces uncertainty, turning ambiguous legal debates into enforceable agreements between parties. For organizations adopting AI, contracts are not just procurement tools but governance instruments, ensuring that copyright and licensing obligations are shared, explicit, and defensible. Litigation trends are beginning to shape the boundaries of copyright and AI more directly. Courts are increasingly asked to decide whether training on copyrighted works without permission constitutes infringement, whether AI outputs can be copyrighted, and who owns them. Each lawsuit contributes to the evolving body of law, narrowing or expanding the permissible boundaries of AI development. For enterprises, these cases are critical signals, revealing how regulators and courts may interpret their practices. Staying informed about litigation trends is therefore essential, as outcomes will redefine risks and obligations. In some cases, settlements or judgments may establish precedents that drive industry-wide changes, such as requiring new licensing schemes or compensatory frameworks for creators. Collective licensing has been proposed as one potential solution to the copyright dilemma in AI training. Under this model, rights holders pool their works into collective management systems, and AI developers pay licensing fees to access them legally. This mirrors how music royalties are managed by collective societies that distribute fees back to artists. Collective licensing could simplify compliance, replacing fragmented negotiations with unified frameworks. However, it raises challenges of scale, enforcement, and fairness, as not all rights holders may wish to participate, and global variation complicates implementation. Still, it offers a promising way to balance the interests of creators and developers, ensuring that innovation is funded while rights are respected. Security implications also arise from copyright and licensing failures. Misusing license data can expose organizations to breaches of trust, both legally and reputationally. For example, if a healthcare AI system inadvertently includes PHI or licensed datasets without authorization, it may trigger lawsuits, fines, or loss of user trust. Furthermore, poor governance may create vulnerabilities, as opaque data pipelines are harder to audit or secure. Copyright and licensing therefore intersect with broader issues of security and compliance, reinforcing that data governance must be holistic. Protecting intellectual property rights is not only about legality, but also about safeguarding organizational integrity and resilience. Evaluation of compliance requires structured processes for verifying that licensing terms are followed in practice. Audits, whether internal or external, can review datasets, model cards, and procurement contracts to ensure alignment with licenses. Certifications or regulatory reviews may provide additional validation, giving organizations formal recognition of compliance. Evaluation also helps identify gaps, such as datasets lacking clear licensing or outputs used in restricted ways. By institutionalizing compliance evaluation, organizations shift from reactive to proactive governance, preventing violations before they escalate into legal disputes. This ongoing process reinforces accountability, ensuring that copyright and licensing obligations are treated as continuous responsibilities rather than one-time hurdles. Attribution tools are emerging to address the complexity of crediting contributors to training datasets. These systems attempt to track which works influenced which parts of a model's behavior, making it possible to recognize creators or allocate royalties. While technically challenging, since models do not store works directly, but statistical patterns progress is being made in aligning attribution with governance goals. Attribution tools can also improve transparency, reassuring creators that their work is acknowledged even if it was not directly reproduced. By embedding attribution into technical systems, AI moves closer to harmonizing with intellectual property frameworks, bridging the gap between machine learning practices and human rights. The distinction between open and closed ecosystems affects how licensing risks are managed. Open source AI emphasizes transparency, community governance, and shared licenses, but it also exposes organizations to risks if terms are misunderstood or ignored. Closed proprietary systems, by contrast, may offer clearer licensing guarantees, but at the cost of opacity and reliance on vendors. Both ecosystems present trade-offs. Open models democratize innovation but complicate compliance, while closed models simplify liability but reduce flexibility. Enterprises must navigate these choices strategically, balancing innovation with governance. The ecosystem chosen shapes not only technical outcomes but also the legal and ethical responsibilities of AI adoption. Public perception plays a powerful role in shaping how copyright controversies affect AI adoption. Even when practices are legally defensible, perceptions of unfairness or exploitation can erode trust. If creators believe their works are being misused without acknowledgement, public backlash may pressure regulators to act more aggressively. Transparency, attribution, and fair compensation help mitigate these risks by aligning organizational practices with public expectations. Organizations must recognize that trust is not built solely on legal compliance but also on social legitimacy. Copyright controversies remind us that AI operates not only under law, but also under the scrutiny of public opinion, Ethical publishing practices reinforce this legitimacy by encouraging organizations to acknowledge data sources even when not strictly required. Ethical practice goes beyond minimum compliance, aiming to respect creators as partners in the innovation ecosystem. For example, research papers may cite datasets and contributors even if licenses do not mandate it. Enterprises may voluntarily disclose training sources or provide credit to communities whose works underpin AI progress. These gestures, while not legally binding, build goodwill and demonstrate a commitment to fairness. Ethical publishing ensures that AI development is not only legally defensible but also socially responsible, strengthening the credibility of the field as a whole. The future of copyright and licensing in AI will be shaped by courts, policymakers, and industry collaboration. Legal frameworks will continue to evolve, clarifying questions of fair use, training data legality, and output ownership. Policymakers may introduce new licensing schemes, collective rights management systems, or obligations for dataset transparency. Industry leaders may develop best practices that preempt regulation, creating voluntary standards for attribution, provenance, or ethical publishing. For organizations, the future requires adaptability. Practices that are defensible today may become insufficient tomorrow. Preparing for this evolution means embedding flexibility, monitoring regulatory trends, and aligning with emerging norms. As copyright and licensing challenges mature, they converge with broader vendor strategies, which help organizations navigate complexity in practice. Enterprises increasingly rely on vendors who assume liability, clarify ownership of outputs, and provide documented compliance with licensing requirements. This shifts the burden from individual adopters to providers, creating shared accountability. Vendor strategy becomes not just a procurement decision, but a governance decision, determining how organizations manage copyright risks while pursuing AI adoption. By choosing vendors carefully, enterprises can mitigate exposure and demonstrate responsibility, aligning innovation with compliance and trust. Copyright and licensing, then, represent not just technical or legal hurdles, but foundational governance concerns that shape the legitimacy and sustainability of AI. They affect how datasets are collected, how outputs are owned, how creators are respected, and how enterprises manage risk. Strong practices in dataset transparency, licensing compliance, attribution, and ethical publishing ensure that AI systems are developed responsibly, balancing innovation with fairness. As legal frameworks evolve and public expectations rise, copyright and licensing will remain central to governance, requiring continuous attention and adaptation. Organizations that treat these issues with seriousness and respect will not only avoid risk but also earn trust, positioning themselves as leaders in responsible AI deployment. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.